Take a moment to reflect on the humble potato, a food that can be prepared in countless ways: boiled, mashed, baked, fried to a crisp, or simmered in a hearty stew. It can even be fermented to make alcohol. Not only is the potato easy to grow, but it also provides a rich source of energy and essential nutrients, enough to sustain entire communities. In Ireland, this crop once symbolized the very hope of survival for millions of people, just like the faith they once placed in the British government to secure even the most basic human rights. Sadly, that dependence would lead to disaster, most notably during the devastating 7-year Great Famine from 1845 to 1852, a historical wound that never fully healed. But the suffering of the Irish people didn't actually begin in the 19th century. If we turn the clock back to 1739, a full century before the Great Famine, we find that a climate catastrophe of massive scale had already struck the island. In the late summer of that year, heavy rains swept across Ireland, flooding farmland. Then suddenly, October brought an abrupt shift, turning dry and bitterly cold. A chilling prelude to what would become the harshest winter Europe had seen that century. Temperatures plummeted over the following months. With dwindling supplies of firewood, people struggled to stay warm, and many froze to death from hypothermia. Remarkably, even the Shannon River, the longest river in Ireland, froze solid. An extraordinary event that has not occurred since. When the ice began to thaw in February, there was hope that things might improve. But instead, the true scale of the disaster became apparent. Crops were almost completely destroyed, and the nation's primary food source, the potato, had rotted in the ground. There were no public emergency food reserves, and the few potatoes stored underground had decayed due to the extreme weather. Worse still, seed potatoes, vital for planting future crops, had also been ruined, making recovery for the next harvest nearly impossible. The climate crisis dragged on into the following year. According to George Faulkner, a witness of the time, there was no rainfall at all between Christmas and April. The land remained bone dry. While Ireland was drowning in hunger and freezing cold, England and Scotland remained relatively unaffected, a stark reminder that Ireland was far from a priority in the eyes of the British Empire. And it wasn't just potatoes that failed. Other key crops like wheat and barley also withered under the harsh, dry conditions. Agriculture as a whole collapsed, and with it, the Irish people were left facing starvation, bitter cold, and a deepening sense of hopelessness. Amid the unfolding climate disaster, food prices skyrocketed at an alarming rate. Wheat alone tripled in price, and nearly all other essential food items saw similar increases, making an already dire situation even worse. It wasn't just people who suffered, livestock and farm animals were also hit hard. The prolonged drought caused a severe shortage of hay and fodder for sheep, cattle, and oxen. According to records kept by George Faulkner, over 40,000 sheep died within just 2 months in the Canuck region of Western Ireland, a staggering figure that highlights the devastating loss of livelihood. As always, the poor bore the brunt of the crisis. With family food stores either spoiled or completely depleted, they were driven to desperation. To survive, they were forced to drastically cut back on their meals, leading to a dramatic drop in daily caloric intake, which severely impacted their health. What little food remained was often neither sanitary nor nutritious. Rotten, sprouting, or moldy potatoes, normally considered inedible, were still cooked and consumed simply because there were no other options. Alongside that, they had to resort to sour milk, wild stinging nettles, plants known for their bitter taste and painful thorns, and anything remotely edible. Regardless of whether it was safe or not, such a poor and unbalanced diet led to widespread outbreaks of disease, especially waves of dysentery that swept through the population, ravaging bodies already weakened by starvation. In many areas, burials became a daily occurrence, with no end in sight to the ongoing tragedy. What made the situation even more heartbreaking was the cruel irony: while the Irish starved, foods like butter, beef, barley, malt, and hake were still being exported abroad. Much of this food was sent to feed British troops stationed in Spain during the War of Jenkins' Ear, while people back home were literally fighting for every meal. Unable to endure the misery any longer, many turned to crime. Food riots broke out across the country, leaving people injured or dead in the chaos. Food theft became rampant, But those labeled as thieves were often just starving citizens trying to survive. Soon, arrests soared, and jails became dangerously overcrowded. To ease the strain on prisons, many of those detained were deported to colonies in the New World as a form of alternative punishment. During this time of crisis, the government had virtually no structured system of aid in place. Most relief efforts came from the grassroots. Local clergymen, church organizations, and landowning aristocrats stepped in to offer whatever support they could. For example, in the city of Waterford, local landowners established a food distribution network that managed to feed about 1,800 people a day, an impressive feat in the face of extreme scarcity. Yet even these well-meaning individual efforts couldn't make up for the absence of a coordinated national support system. And so, thousands continued to perish quietly, lost in one of the darkest chapters of Irish history. During those dark and desperate times, not only the major cities but also many smaller towns and villages, such as Castell, took it upon themselves to organize grassroots relief efforts. Local residents rallied their communities, called for donations, used the money collected to purchase food, and distributed it to the starving and the sick. A few wealthy landlords and industrialists also tried to ease the crisis by launching public works projects. These temporary jobs provided a way for struggling families to earn some income and feed themselves. However, despite the good intentions of many individuals and groups, the lack of centralized coordination from the government meant these relief efforts were limited in scope and often inefficient. Scattered and small scale, they were simply not enough to counteract a national disaster of such magnitude. Some international aid did arrive, with food imported from abroad, but distribution was uneven. Most of the supplies went to coastal regions, cities and port towns, while rural and inland communities were largely left behind. Weather conditions in 1740 remained unfavorable. Rainfall was scarce, leaving the land dry and cracked, and almost every farming attempt ended in failure. When winter came, temperatures dropped abnormally low again, wiping out the last surviving crops that Irish farmers had struggled to plant. By 1741, the situation grew even more dire. The population continued to decline sharply due to prolonged hunger and widespread disease outbreaks that no one could contain. With nowhere else to turn, food riots erupted across the country. The most violent of these took place on April 25, 1741, when a group of starving farmers stormed a ship carrying a shipment of oats docked in Waterford. They managed to seize about 60 barrels of oats, but the cost was high. 5 people were killed, and 11 others were injured, an agonizing illustration of just how desperate the people had become. Yet by mid-1741, there were signs of hope. In June, 5 large ships docked in Galway, bringing imported grain that helped relieve some of the food shortages. Just a month later, food prices began to drop, returning to near pre-crisis levels, offering a flicker of optimism to a population that had endured so much suffering. In September, Ireland was struck by a series of violent storms that caused severe flooding. Fortunately, shortly afterward, the weather returned to normal. The following winter was much milder, and with more favorable conditions, farmers were finally able to plant again, marking the end of a nightmare that had lasted for 2 long years. The Irish named this famine Bliain an Éire, or the Year of the Slaughter, a phrase that reflects the deep pain and unimaginable loss they had experienced. It is estimated that around 400,000 people died from starvation and disease, accounting for approximately 15% of Ireland's entire population at the time. Although this number remains debated due to the lack of detailed records, it highlights the unprecedented scale and brutality of a tragedy that still stands as one of the worst humanitarian disasters in modern Irish history. The famine that lasted from 1740 to 1741 claimed the lives of a significant portion of Ireland's population. In terms of mortality rate, it far surpassed even the more well-known Great Famine that occurred later in the mid-19th century, 1845 to 1852. Yet, what's particularly striking is that this tragic event of the early 18th century didn't leave as deep an imprint on Ireland's collective memory as the Great Famine did. There are several reasons that help explain this. Although some people were forced to leave their homeland, whether deported to colonies for breaking the law or voluntarily leaving in search of work, there was no large-scale emigration at the time. Simply put, most of the poor didn't have the financial means to leave. After the deadly and devastating period, the weather gradually stabilized, which allowed Ireland's agricultural economy to recover relatively quickly. Because of this, the famine of 1740 to 1741, though catastrophic, didn't trigger a cultural or political shock like the one caused by the Great Famine. Over time, this event faded from public memory, like an old wound buried beneath larger historical upheavals that came later. Still, both disasters, the one in 1740 and the series of crop failures in the 1840s, stand as two of the deadliest tragedies in Ireland's modern history. And history didn't stop there. In 1879, just a few decades after the Great Famine, Ireland once again faced a failed harvest, though on a much smaller scale. The cause remained the same: poor weather and the return of potato blight, the fungal disease that had once wiped out the nation's crops a generation earlier. This time, many areas, especially in the western regions, still relied heavily on potatoes. So when the crops died en masse, the threat of hunger loomed once again. Fortunately, this time, the human cost was far lower, thanks to several key advantages compared to the earlier famines. The railroad network had expanded significantly, allowing food reserves and aid from other areas to be transported quickly to the regions most affected. In addition, the British government responded more effectively, and international aid poured in, especially from Irish communities abroad, who moved swiftly to help. Irish Americans, many of whom were descendants of those who had fled the Great Famine, didn't hesitate to act in the face of this new crisis. The American press provided extensive coverage, with the New York Herald playing a central role in mobilizing public support and fundraising efforts. Thanks to those efforts, around $200,000 was raised, a huge amount at the time. Most notably, in March 1880, the U.S. Navy deployed the warship USS Constellation, loaded with 3,300 barrels of food and clothing, to cross the Atlantic and deliver vital aid to the people of Ireland in their hour of need. Although the crisis of 1879 to 1880 did not result in massive loss of life or large-scale emigration like earlier disasters, its social impact was far deeper than it might appear on the surface. At the time, Ireland's land ownership system was deeply unjust. Nearly all agricultural land, up to 97%, was owned by wealthy landlords, often English, while most native Irish farmers worked as tenants on the very land their families had lived on for generations. When the harvests failed, countless families found themselves unable to pay rent, with their income wiped out and their crops destroyed. Some landlords showed compassion by waiving or postponing rent collection. However, many others remained cold and unyielding, demanding payment even as their tenants faced starvation and destitution. Long-held resentment finally boiled over into organized resistance. Poor farmers began to unite, demanding fair rights to the land they worked. This gave birth to the Irish Land League, a large-scale movement led by two influential nationalist figures, Michael Davitt and Charles Stewart Parnell. The League didn't just push for lower rents, it launched a broader campaign calling for land ownership to be transferred to those who actually worked the soil. Through organized civil disobedience, public boycotts, and mass mobilization, they laid the foundation for Ireland's wider independence movement that would grow throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One especially high-profile case that captured the public's attention involved Charles Cunningham Boycott, a land agent infamous for his harsh and unrelenting stance. At a time when the people were suffering immensely from hunger and poverty, he refused to lower rents or provide any relief, and went as far as evicting tenants who couldn't pay. His actions ignited a storm of protest. The workers on the estates he managed went on strike, refusing to cooperate until fairer conditions were met. No one would harvest the crops, no one would deliver supplies, and no one would work the land. Boycott found himself completely isolated. The incident became so well known that his name, boycott, was adopted into the English language as a verb, meaning to withdraw cooperation as a form of peaceful protest. This marked the first time in modern history that a proper name became a universally recognized action word. Born directly from a grassroots rebellion sparked by hunger and injustice. And all of it, from famine and mass mobilization to a pivotal moment in Irish history, was set in motion by a seemingly humble crop, the potato.